It's almost like it is the pandemic again. Okay, so remember, naturalism is really the key thing we're going to be focusing on still, with a little bit of scale and proportion to kind of enhance our understanding of naturalism. And remember, like I was just saying, that naturalism goes back to this physical reality of the human body. So this is a drawing by Da Vinci based on a writing by a guy named Vitruvius from like 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. And Da Vinci went into the library, found the book, and made an illustration based on the book. And so, for instance, here he realizes the arm span of the human body is equal to the height of the human body, little things like that. And so these discoveries go a long way in helping artists kind of theoretically understand the nature of looking at something and making it look real. What are the attributes of real that make something look real and bring it to life? So if you guys are new to us today, what we're seeing as an example of that is this original kind of Egyptian model, Egyptian mold, which feels and looks to me very cookie cutter, which is not to say bad, but it feels like it's really meant to be like a almost mass reproduced kind of object that is looks human, but doesn't really act the way or move the way human beings act, which is to say you'll never kind of see me standing like this or like this, because that's just not very human. Like, that's not how we behave. But when you look at how I'm really standing, or even how you guys are sitting, none of you is like upright, you're all kind of slouched or chill or resting because gravity is exerting itself on your body. And so this is the result of an artist using naturalism, observing something to make it look real and look alive and look like a real person. So what kinds of things do you see here? Just as a review, what kinds of things make this look very real, like it's alive? What do you notice here? Go ahead.
The shoulders are down.
Yeah, you notice the shoulders kind of are part of the kind of overall kind of musculature of the body, like kind of relaxing. The shoulders are back. They feel kind of very real, like based on observation. What else? Anything else? Yes. Yeah, he's leaning, he's shifting his weight from one side to the next. And we all can relate that. We all understand kind of, very rarely, unless you're like Superman posing or posing for photo, do you keep your weight centered. So it's something very relatable because he looks almost like just normal, right? And that I think is a big achievement, especially when you think about using this principle to bring the gods to life, to bring the gods down from heaven to earth and make them look real and believable. And so last week we were talking about this sort of difference between Egypt and Greece. You see that in sculpture, this transition from the more Egyptian style to more Greek style. And that mirrors what we see as the civilizations giving life to those objects. Egyptian society is much more about the hierarchy, the pharaohs on top, everyone else is down below. Greek society is a lot more about everyone participating. Of course, there were slaves and all kinds of other restrictions, but just comparing one to the other, you do see a divergence between one and the other. And that's based on a lot of things, geography and other things. Nevertheless, I want you guys to keep internalizing this idea that art is very much related to the values that the culture that creates it. So, Greece adopts a very different attitude towards, for instance, expansion. Egypt was very happy being adjacent to the Nile, a very regular river that's predictable, reliable source of food, no reason to expand outward, whereas Greece doesn't have access to all the same resources. And so Greece was like, let me go conquer other areas and get all those things that we need. Also, it was a response to the Persians conquering Greece, as you saw in the video. So today, we're really going to see how the Greek get paybacks against the Persians. You need a chair, you need to find a chair. So, okay, great, thank you. So when we see this transition, we're talking about kind of this transformation from this to this. And this is really the difference between the era before Alexander the Great, the classical period, and then Alexander the Great, which we see on the right side. It's not Alexander the Great, but this is the kind of transformation we see with sculptures during this several hundred-year period in the aftermath of Alexander the Great. And so what changes? What do we see? Are they both accurate?
It's the one on the left, Alexander. And then so Heracles is much
right. Yeah, it's not actually Alexander the Great, but I'm saying that we're going to learn about in a moment that between these two sculptures is a big kind of change in society, which is Alexander the Great conquering Persia.
Like it's the dude on the left. He looks like a normal guy.
Yeah, he looks more normal, right? So before Alexander the Great, this is kind of the style that the Greeks adopted. It was very kind of accurate. It doesn't feel too inflated, too exaggerated, too beyond believability. After Alexander the Great, you see sculpture shift to this much more kind of theatrical, epic scale. He looks much more exaggerated, right? Still somewhat believable, but certainly pushing the bounds of believability. You agree? I'll send you a video to watch more about this. And by the way, this is Hercules, as you said. So what do we know about Hercules?
He's Zeus's son.
Right.
And he's super strong.
Right, super strong. And he's half man, half god, right? Because Zeus, I think, would often philander with mortal women, as I think any god or goddess would do. And so he gives rise to Hercules, who's half man and half god. Does he look more man or god here?
He looks godly.
What's that?
He looks more godly.
So I think he definitely looks more godly compared to this guy in terms of his stature, his physicality. What about him emphasizes the more human qualities?
Like the way he's postured, and
What about that?
feels like very, very relaxed. It's
Very relaxed, right? Not necessarily god-like, right? You agree?
Yeah, I was gonna say like he looks tired.
Yeah, he looks tired, worn out. And so in a way, the sculpture is emphasizing the more human side, the more frail side, the more weak side, right? The side of us that isn't all powerful, which is what a god is, right? Everyone follow? So what we need to now do is understand, well, what led to artists shifting from this more quote unquote accurate style to this style here. And it really has to do with sort of the outlandish nature of Alexander the Great's sort of ambitions to conquer the world and use sculpture to kind of brand his empire. Because you think about it, if you conquer someplace, it's one thing to conquer, it's another thing to permanently occupy, right? And every civilization has to wrestle with how do you kind of absorb other cultures and maybe not lose a sense of identity. And sculpture very much plays a role in this kind of cultural conquest. And I'll send you a video about Hercules, by the way. So before we get there, understand that leading up to this era, the Greeks have already kind of started visualizing the gods in human terms. We've gotten away from the Egyptian idea of gods with animal heads because there's something very relatable about the gods. And now nudity will be something that the Romans get rid of. The Romans aren't cool with nudity. That's why Christianity kind of likewise is not as immodest perhaps as Greeks were. But just remember, when the Greeks had nudity, it wasn't to sexualize the sculptures. It was to showcase or act as a metaphor for other things like innocence or purity or heroism, right? So the Greeks didn't look at this and like, oh, Zeus is naked. It's like, no, Zeus is pure. Zeus is kind of in his own, self-confident. To be a god is to be comfortable in your own skin, right? But that's not to say that the Greeks weren't well aware of the kind of what you could call tension or emotional or awkwardness of nudity. And I think we all understand that too. That's why Barbie dolls don't have nipples because they're not meant to be sexualized, and a lot of sculptures don't have certain details, shrunken genitalia. We'll see today examples of the body being covered in silk, for instance. Now, in this case, what is she preserving a little bit of modesty in this case here? What about her feels modest? Yeah, she's covered. Just to have her cover herself up a little bit is a way of saying she's not fully, like happy about being fully exposed. She wants to preserve some sense of modesty, right? And so the point there is beauty is not about just being perfect and exposed, but rather having a sense of modesty, because that's the true nature of beauty. Just imagine, someone who's like, I am so beautiful and perfect and everything around me is great. Is that attractive? No, it's like, that's like really ugly, right? When and what's more attractive is someone has beauty and they're not really aware of it or about that. So there's a kind of tension between modesty and sexuality here. And that really goes to the idea of personifying values, personifying the idea of love in physical terms, right? How do you bring to life something that is an abstract concept like love or like strength or like liberty or what else? Like victory would be another one, right? So that's what the Greeks are partly doing with sculpture, as well as, of course, we're going to see branding the kind of the face of the leader. So we've already looked at two examples here, several examples of female sculptures with, especially this question of nudity. Here she's nude, but it's not about, being sexual. It's about reproduction. Here she's nude, and this looks a lot more like kind of sexualizing her. It's really about her being powerful. And then in this case, likewise, she's nude, but it's really about modesty. So very interesting kind of storytelling when it comes to nudity. And none of them are about this like sexuality or sexualizing the sculptures. So in this case, I think you see a wonderful example of personifying something. So does anyone know who Nike is? So who is Nike?
Roman or Greek goddess, right?
Good. Of, we're on the right track. Anyone know? I think good. Victory, right? So the company Nike wisely picked you're not going to pick, I don't know, Neptune if you're, God, making shoes, but Victory is a really smart goddess to pick. Are there any goddesses or gods of losing? Is there a god of losing, do you think? Why not?
Because the gods, just in their nature, they personify losing.
Yeah, why not? But why wouldn't we personify losing? We agree, though, at least we don't do that. So anyone explain why? Any explanation why? Thank you, your hero.
Put the God on a pedestal, so why would you like?
Yeah, why are you gonna
Why
put
would you
losing on a
drag them
pedestal? You're not
down?
gonna, oh, I worship, and there's no,
Why would you strive
imagine
to
religion all
lose?
based on kind of like worshiping, being a loser. And what would a sculpture of a loser, quote unquote, even look like? You're cowering away, like, don't pick me, like, I don't want to be looked at. You wouldn't even want to be seen. It's like a sculptor doesn't want to be on the pedestal, right? So you can understand underlying sculptures, this idea of a value system, something we look up to, we aspire to be like. So now, having said that, the Greeks didn't understand a victory in terms of adrenaline. They weren't like, oh, when you win, you get the surge of adrenaline, you feel good, you feel euphoria. And they understood that, and they understood it felt that way. But so how have they visualized victory here? What does victory to them look like? What to you do you see here?
It's like the pose.
Good. What about the pose?
Well, if it had arms, it would probably be outstretched.
Yeah, it's nice to kind of imagine. I would think the arms would be like something like this, really powerful, kind of triumphant. They certainly wouldn't be like, or maybe like this, like they're about to take off. But you kind of don't need them because the sculpture already kind of has so much of that confidence that you can just, the arms are almost an afterthought because you don't need them to really kind of understand that the whole message here is like, what is going on here? What do you feel when you look at this? Or what do we see? Is it standing still?
Obviously, the wings stick out, so it makes me think like you said, they're taking off or something.
Yeah, it looks like they're about to like unfold their wings or stretched out their wings because they're about to take off. Like it really looks like she's stepping forward, like she's about to like jump off a cliff and just float away. I think that's the idea. And is that how you feel when you've won something? Have you ever won something? When you win, or you're like, oh, and you're like, whoo, yes, I won, you suck, or whatever, right? Not you, the other person, right? So, this looks really accurate as far as the movement. You notice we were talking about this sort of sensualizing the figure underneath with the silk. You get the best of both worlds. You can see the body, but it's also somewhat sexualized, it's somewhat sensual. And does the movement look believable to you? Yeah, I mean, it really looks like it's actually moving. And what about the wings? Do humans have wings? And if you really wanted to fly, would you need bigger wings than this? Probably, right? So it's kind of like a metaphor of flight, right? So you're not meant to see this as literally, the right scale for wings to make you fly. But I think you get the idea. It transmits how we feel when we're victorious. Like you want to fly, you want to, float above everything else. And this is, wonderful example of personifying victory in physical terms that, otherwise, how would you personify victory? How would you bring victory to life in physical terms? Well, there's a lot of choices. And I think this is a really nice selection by them to kind of show a woman about to take off. And this is the kind of theatricality that comes at the end of this age of Alexander the Great, because they're just sort of shifting sculpture from its original sort of emphasis on accuracy to something that's a lot more about storytelling, about drama, and about, theatricality. And so this empire, like I said, and if you watch the video, is paybacks for the Persians defeating Athens and burning Athens down. I mean, otherwise, I think we'd probably say that's really mean of the Greeks to do what they did. But in a way, you could see this sort of ebb and flow of civilization. And I would argue that this continues today with this sort of kind of dilemma of bridging the East and the West, because we want to trade with each other. We want to have, access to each other. And of course, that's the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz here. And if ever these get closed off, like it did a few months ago, a year ago, when the ship kind of went sideways, I don't know if you remember, world trade shut down because China needs oil from other countries, or China does not operate. That's why they're building all those dams, because they want to have hydroelectric power. And if China wants oil, it needs to trade with people in the Middle East. But guess who has the biggest navy in the world? We do, right? So there's this tension between kind of the East and the West, which continues today. I mean, the Black Sea is right here. Russia's trying to get access to a warm water port. Israel is a hotbed, as you know, of tension. And, all that is really still the case back in the ancient world in this area, because this is the real hub nexus point of access between East and West. Now, when Columbus comes around, he's like, you're going to go around all that. And that is a very important kind of chapter in the story of globalization. And I think the best way for you guys to understand this is like the beginning of globalization, beginning of people trying to use technology and human wherewithal to be able to bridge the East and West and have some kind of steady, reliable access to things like silk or to things like textiles from India or all kinds of other spices and things that come from the kind of this region. And likewise, people want to trade with Europeans for other stuff and benefit from all this sort of trade in the Mediterranean. So you could say this is a political conquest, but it's also kind of an economic sort of expansion. And it's also a moment of kind of cross-pollination between groups that otherwise are very, divided by language and otherwise. And he gets all the way to India. And what do you think stops him there? Why stop there?
I'm not sure.
Okay, good, pass. What do you think?
The Persian.
Yeah, it could be just people have stopped. I think at this point, I can't remember the name of the Porus was the name. The Indians had battle elephants. That's where they eventually adopted the battle elephants that you see in movies from this part of the world. And the battle elephant is like an early tank. It's going to just mow over your infantry. So you need some kind of there's an arms race in the ancient world for how do you have the best, strongest army, and some of it was chariots, and then Alexander the Great figures out you can just move your soldiers aside and the chariots will go right through. So that kind of changed the balance of power between chariots and non-chariots. And basically the ancient world is might makes right. Whoever is the most might is going to be the most as legitimate claim to authority. And we've moved past that today, happily, but we still live in an era where it's all about conquest. And in order to conquer, you also need to preserve your power wherever you conquer. And that's, of course, where sculpture comes in, because sculpture is a great way to brand your image. And that's why we see Alexander the Great kind of as a pharaoh here, because he conquered Egypt. And in other cases, he's kind of just using his face to let people know, I am your new leader. And it's a very youthful view of leadership, too. Before him, a lot of the sculptures were of kings with beards. And so it is kind of like a new vision of leadership based on youth and all the promise of youth. And that's probably, the beardlessness is also very much about military. You don't want to have a beard in battle because the enemy can pull your beard. And so in addition to him absorbing, becoming, you could say transmitting Greek values wherever he traveled, he also absorbed the cultures that he conquered and became very much like the cultures he conquered and started imagining himself a pharaoh and a king and god king once he conquers Egypt. And as we all know, that's not good. You lose the audience's sympathy once you do that. And so that kind of is the beginning of the end. Once a leader kind of starts thinking they're bigger than their britches, they're a god. Once your friend starts saying to you, I think I might be a god, you maybe want to reevaluate that friendship. Like to maybe call a psychologist. And so we're going to see that this kind of Greek culture and the impact of Alexander the Great will last beyond him, especially with the Roman Empire, because the area that he conquers fragments and disintegrates very shortly thereafter, because it's really hard to keep a whole new kingdom together, especially if you're kind of a foreign occupier. And the Romans kind of figure out how to figure out that riddle of how to have longevity in places where you conquer, but we'll talk about them another day. So you notice one difference between the Romans and the Greeks is nudity and the lack of nudity in Roman culture, whereas Greeks were all about nudity. And as you could see here, that really is why these two sculptures are so important. One is fairly capturing this sort of more theatrical approach to storytelling. And I want to show you some more examples now that really, I think, show you this sort of the variety of sculpture from this period. And notice when he conquered, he goes eastward and goes immediately down to Egypt, because this is really the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. This is the reliable Nile, reliable food supply, very regular, reliable food from the Nile. And of course, going eastward, it's all about reaching India and the textiles and hopefully eventually getting to China. But I think at this point, probably it's the Himalayas that really stopped him. India is famously very hard to conquer because they're fierce and huge numbers of people. And that's why they resisted Islam for many centuries. Eventually, they succumbed to Islam. China, even more ferocious. I mean, Rome, we'll learn later, tries to go into China, and the Chinese are like, no, and they just conquer the Romans, annihilated them. And that's, you know, a little too ambitious to go that far, I think, for the Romans. But anyways, Alexander the Great gets this far. His soldiers are like, we're not going any further. And eventually he marches back, eventually dies, I think, poison. And not long after, his empire collapses. But that's not to say that he doesn't leave a very important imprint where he conquers. And now we, of course, will look at the sculpture from this time period. So let's take a look at this, a few examples. So would you call this an example of naturalism? Is this here naturalistic? Does it look like the artist observed a horse, for instance? Yeah, I think it's pretty spot on. What about it looks accurate?
Striations in the horse's muscles.
Yeah, everyone sees that almost rippling muscles, the way you kind of like doing a horse in motion, like, you know, capturing it accurately is really hard because horses don't stay still. So it's really impressive whenever someone achieves some kind of accuracy when it comes to something that's like slithery or gallopy or hoppy or whatever, moves a lot. And that's very impressive to me. I mean, I don't know if it's impressive to you, but maybe I'm easily impressed. I don't know. What's the least accurate looking part of the horse?
Legs, though.
Maybe the legs. For me, it's the tail feels a little bit like an afterthought. I think it's just fun to think about, you know, which we tend to maybe be more accurate with faces and maybe other parts because we have a hierarchy of, you know, parts of the body that we take interest in, right? Like our ears are very personal and very individualized and very visible, right? Our feet are too, but we're not as comfortable with our feet in public, right? And there's kind of hierarchy of body parts that are like, you know, publicly on display in art, you know, and likewise a horse, you know, maybe the horse is the last thing you notice. And so the artist didn't really care too much. I don't think they realized one day we'd be, you know, inspecting his horse under such scrutiny. So what's this now that I agree, this horse looks great. Really, even the face, like really feels like the horse is almost like wondering what's going on. And what is going on? What's the story here? What's happening here?
I know. She's like running away.
Who?
The person on the horse.
Well, and who is the person? King?
It just looks like some girls like flicking us off. I don't know.
Some what?
Some girls like flicking us
Yeah,
off.
it does almost look like he's giving us the bird, the figure. Does that look like that? I think he might be holding something, but I love the idea. He's like, because for me, I like that interpretation. And I don't think there's anyone out there who can run it. What do you think going on?
This is young Alexander.
And that's how I kind of feel. Now, you know, he's famous for the horse and all that. I don't know if that's what's going on, but really feels like that's trying to capture, like, you know, Alexander the Great, almost like a version of him riding off on his horse. So if that's the case, I like the idea of what you said, the flicking him off, because it's almost like a kid who's stealing his parents' car.
Yeah.
I had one kid in my last class who admitted that he did steal the parents' car, and I asked him if they ever found out. He said, no. I'm gonna keep that a secret. You guys can say, you ever steal your parents' car?
Yeah.
Yeah, wait, yes. Who said yes? Yeah. And did you, like, obviously you're okay. Was the car okay?
Yeah, I mean, I was like basically an adult when it happened. My
Okay.
car wouldn't start. My parents were asleep.
Okay, so it wasn't really like you stole the car. It's more like, you know, circumstances led you to criminality, right? And so when, this is borrowing long term without permission. And so what did your parents find out?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of
They woke
course.
up like an hour later. They're like, "Where's the car?"
Okay, and where was the car?
I took it with me to do what I needed to do.
And what did you do?
Nothing.
Nothing at all. Okay, but you guys can appreciate it. I think that's kind of what's going on here. You agree the kid does not belong on this horse? He had no saddle. What do you think? I don't think the kid was gonna last much longer on this horse unless he's really like, you know, some kind of like ninja, because that looks way too big and he's out of his element, in over his head, as it were. But does the kid seem afraid? No, and I think that's part of the appeal of sculpture. He's just like not even like aware of the danger he's in. And there's a certain appeal to this because it's like we can all kind of relate to the idea of a kid who's, it's a story, right? It's a story here that it's not just a kid on a sculpture. The artist trying to combine a horse with a kid, because that's more interesting than a horse with a, who cares if it's an old guy, but a kid on a horse. Now I'm like, what's gonna happen here? What's going on here? So let's look at a few more examples from this era just to show you the real wizardry of the sculpture from this era. What's the appeal here?
Lady covered in some cloth.
Yeah, I think the idea is that they're turning marble, which is, you know, as hard as a rock, literally as a rock, into something that looks transparent and wet and silky and soft. And that's the last thing you would say about marble, that it's wet and transparent and silky and soft. But they've transformed rock into something that looks like clothing. And it's really a remarkable achievement, to the point that I almost like, you know, just wonder about how they, you know, it's one thing to carve a face, another thing to carve a face with the details like this. And they must have been observing someone, but even still, it's really just a remarkable achievement by an artist to make it feel like there's a face underneath that fabric. I mean, I hope you agree. So let's see some more examples. And that's just kind of one, one point on the spectrum. Here is like another, whole nother kind of emotion. So what would you say is the emotion being transmitted here? If you could reduce this to one word. Is he happy? Is he like chilling? Is he chilling?
Like anguish.
Anguish. Okay, I like anguish because sort of like he's down on the ground, struggling,
He looks desperate
desperate. Why did you say desperate?
because his shield's cracking. I don't know if that's.
Oh, good.
intentional or
Yeah, I like that.
unintentional.
It could be either almost the rock or the shield. We could almost interpret it either way, as like maybe even
Well, it is a
his
shield because he's got the armband.
right. Oh no, I agree. It's definitely a shield, but I like the idea that it could be like just the rock cracking over wear and tear, but then it could also be the shield is literally the last thing that's giving him shelter is now about to kind of disintegrate.
And he's a soldier. He's,
Right.
like, down on the ground. He looks like he's
Right.
trying to cover
It
his
feels,
back.
yeah, he's down on the ground, and you think about what circumstances led to him being on the ground. Maybe he's injured, maybe his legs been, amputated, cut off by a sword, and it feels like he's just dragging himself. What makes you think he might be dragging himself rather than just chilling?
The right arm.
Yeah, you notice he's got literally like the way you think about drag yourself, maybe to the point where your fingers are so tired or maybe worn out from wear and tear that you just kind of now you're just pushing up the most sort of reliable part of your body, that like bottom of the fist. So yeah, absolutely. I feel like he's kind of pulling himself. And the shield, I feel like he's almost like using the shield to like inch himself forward. Like he's using that shield like to pull himself, like lurch off the battlefield. Did you follow what I'm saying there? And the arm there with the vein really feels like you need that to convey a sense of struggle and tension, because that vein is so important to understanding he's flexing that arm, this like tension and blood flowing there. And again, that's another remarkable achievement. That's like what we just saw with the veil of marble covering her face. It's like skin covering the veins. It's really wonderful, rich details that make you feel the struggle and the emotion. And we don't even notice his face as part of like that emotion. I mean, it's part of it, but the face is like the last thing that transmits emotion here. I mean, it is, yeah, he's looking down and all that, but just such a wildly kind of subtle story about kind of someone struggling on the battlefield to get off and get out of danger. It's really impressive.
Is that supposed to be a helmet on top of his head with the hole in it?
Yeah, I think that's supposed to be a helmet, just like a kind of ancient helmet. But yeah, now that you look at it, I bet you it does look a little kind of like a pretty silly design that would probably not pass military standards today,
Probably.
especially the whole part. So here's another example. So here's another great example. Like we've seen this kind of already with a woman preserving her modesty. Now, in this case, this is kind of a common story in the ancient world, the goddess bathing, and then a stupid mortal who's just wandering through the forest, and he sees some sort of maybe gold shimmery light, and there's the goddess Venus bathing. And what should you do if you're in a forest in the ancient world and you see the goddess of beauty? What should you do? Run, right? Very good. Smart guy. Listen to this guy. Run. Why? Because thou shalt not behold the goddess of beauty, right? She is not for your mortal eye. She is, a goddess, right? In all of her glory. So you're not supposed to interrupt her in her inner sanctum, in her sort of moment of vulnerability. So that's why I think these moments are so fun, because it's really all about kind of the goddess with her sort of peace being interrupted by some stupid mortal, which is kind of what we're doing. We'll just like by looking at her, we are kind of equivalent of someone watching the goddess. So she's looking this way, like she's just been interrupted from what she's doing. And you notice, I love the way the hand, this is a great little detail here, because it's sort of like, your hand goes up according to where your attention is, just sort of like, and you don't really do it consciously, right? It's unconscious. Like what part of our body is involuntarily moving right now without you needing to be like, okay, do this, okay, do that, do this, do that. Like my hand doesn't just do that without me thinking it. What parts of your body move? There's your eye, maybe moving your eyes where you're looking, blinking. So you don't really think about that. It just doesn't. Now, of course, you can think about it. What else? What other part of your body? What's that?
On the outside.
Yeah, I think like the heartbeat, of course, all the stuff on the inside is kind of working on its own. That'd be an example.
You like to.
Yeah, people like whatever sort of decorum they're trying to preserve, since demeanor, the foot is always like a giveaway about like sort of an internal state, right? Whether you're in the subway watching someone putting on makeup, their foot's always going to reveal something about their inner state. And I think you see that with animals, like what is the thing that tells you about what mood a cat is in? How do you know? If you should go pet it, look, hello, little kitty. Facial expression or what else?
Tail.
Yeah, the tail, right? The tail wagging dog, the tail straight up and alert. You better be careful, right? So human beings likewise have a sort of puppetry. And here in this case, she's sort of coiled up, like bathing. But that coil, what's it? Why have her coiled up like this? Is there a sort of theatrical quality to that? If you think about it, if you're watching someone on stage, even a batter like winding up, there's a certain kind of intensity, suspense to like someone winding up because they're pulling all their potential energy together, and then it's going to explode into kind of whatever happens next. And that's kind of the drama here. She's about to react to whatever's taking place. Here, I think shows you that kind of same idea, the coiled up body. And then here on the right, the body that's sort of relaxing, chilling, emphasizing the more human quality. The kid, mischievous kid, I think we can all relate to that. This is one I think is really exceptional and one I like a lot. What is the value here? Is this a beautiful woman? It's meant to be like she's so beautiful and young and like healthy and fit. Yeah, it looks like an elderly woman doing what? What's she doing here?
Looks like she's carrying groceries.
Yeah, like go walking home from Trader Joe's or New York City. You see the woman pushing the cart. That's very common once you get a certain age in New York. You switch to the cart. Now you're pushing a cart with groceries. And do we tend to like when you guys see an older person? I think we probably just whiz right by them, kind of walking at a different maybe pace, and probably like don't have smartphones or whoever knows what else. And I think this is a remarkable example of artists looking at everyday subjects rather than just looking at who's the hottest, who's the strongest, who's the best, who's the biggest. And I think that's a remarkable part of this culture that artists had so interest in everyday subject, because I think that's more contemporary, like the world we live in today, than you would expect. Let me just show you what is the perhaps maybe not beauty, but like beauty in a more expanded sense. What is the beauty of this figure? What do you think is the merit or the value of this person that the artist wanted to show?
I guess like her in the silk.
Her what?
Her like covered in the cloth.
Yeah, maybe the textures of the fabric to kind of just show you the kind of way her body and the fabric kind of shows you the body underneath. What else?
The thing that I kept most of was the baskets, but we went over that.
What's that?
Was the baskets, but we went over that already.
Yeah, it could be, the details of the basket. If you feel the weight here, you definitely feel her struggle. And then it could be a sort of resilience, maybe struggle, the fact that she's, independent, able to do this on her own still. You can interpret a lot of different ways, but we're definitely not looking at like the goddess of beauty here or the god of strength or the god of the ocean. We're looking at like an everyday person. I think that really is just a wonderful, if we look at the spectrum of things we've seen, this is a really neat way or it's just a neat inclusion, because it feels very much like the world today. Like this is something an artist today would sort of, do a sculpture of to show that we take interest in everyday subjects and not just, the most beautiful, in an age like Hitler, during Hitler's age, you probably wouldn't do sculpture something like this. You do, let me show you the most beautiful example of German, quote unquote, German beauty, right? The ideal. And of course, ideals are very, very tricky because one, they're unattainable, right? And in a way, I think we live in an age of Instagram where everything's about comparing yourself to an ideal. And you don't really see this on Instagram, right? You don't see, let me show you someone struggling and having a, hard time. And you show like, I'm perfect, I'm beautiful, I'm eating a lot of food that you're not eating, kicking ass. So I think we live in an age that's more about idealism and not realism. And that will probably, the pendulum will shift probably back. So now some examples of busts, heads that show you, I think, the real diversity of the Roman Empire. We haven't talked about the Roman Empire, but we will. And the Rome basically absorbs the kind of legacy of Alexander the Great, especially because they conquer Greece. And Rome, as we'll see, becomes a sort of accumulation of all the places it conquers. It starts absorbing their culture and starts resembling all the places they conquer. So including the leaders who will, in some cases, be from North Africa. In this case, I can't remember his name. This is a Libyan leader. So the Roman Empire is part Africa, part Middle East, part Southern Europe, and reflects all of the diversity of the people who are from the Roman Empire. And of course, what unified everyone under that empire is citizenship, the idea that you're citizens, maybe not even a common language, but certainly the United States has a lot of parallels to ancient Rome, because we are likewise a melting pot society. And what we have in common is a language and a kind of maybe culture. And that's what these sculptures are doing, kind of transmitting that Roman culture. And they're really powerful. I mean, from the details of the hair to the individualism of this figure. It really looks like this figure staring at us across time and is still alive and kind of talking to us and looking at us. And it's really, and a later date, we'll talk about the differences between, what kind of color of stone you use. But I think this is a great example for now to just point out that you notice when you use a darker granite, whatever this is, it almost allows you to get closer up to it and wants to make you bring up close to it. Whereas this kind of reflective white is something you can see from farther away. It's meant to just be more visible. So we'll see examples of this on a later date, but just keep in mind, color is another subject we're saving for a later date. But really, so exact, almost like Nefertiti, what we saw a few weeks ago. And, so wonderful when it comes to these details. And you notice we've shifted away from using sculpture just to show gods or goddesses or to show, Alexander the Great, to now it looks like these are probably Roman women who are like today, people showing off their hairstyles on Instagram. They're all kind of like wanting to, first you get the haircut, then you go to see the sculptor kind of thing. They were probably in adjacent, buildings, and then you go show all your friends. And God bless them for doing this. I think they're really wonderful examples of just how important hairstyle was to the ancient world. It almost looks like Cheerios. So in addition to this very kind of interesting transformation of sculpture that takes place in this period, and will culminate with places and be part of a bigger sort of ecosystem of art that I think you see here, including amphitheaters, everything, libraries, saunas, gymnasiums, everything you kind of come to University of Tampa for. They would build in these places they conquered, because if you're going to conquer a place, you want to replicate something familiar about your own culture, but you also need to provide value to people and transmit your culture. And that's really what you see going on with sculpture, them telling stories, transmitting cultures. And in this case, we've got a scene of the gods fighting the giants. So this is like people like Zeus and Ares and Athena fighting the giants, who are the ones having their hair pulled. And you can see these angels of victory, winged victories, as Nikes in the back. And these will all become Christian angels. When Christianity becomes a religion of Rome, they're going to use a lot of the Roman attributes of culture, like angels, and they will become sort of Christian emissaries to heaven. So we're already seeing some of the building blocks of Christianity. Just remember, we're not Christian yet, or at least the Romans aren't Christian yet. Next time, we'll learn about that transition from paganism to Christianity. And as a final note, I just want to show you, we'll look at this one. This is a great example of the Romans, running with this legacy of, dramatic theatrical sculptures. Anyone know who this is? And know the story that this is? Anyone familiar at all? You get the Trojans and the Greeks, the Trojan War. That's when the Greeks were fighting the Trojans for basically Turkey for about, I think, 10 years. And then the Greeks build a horse, put a bunch of soldiers inside and leave it there. The Trojans, sorry if anyone's Trojans, stupidly bring the horse into Troy and think we've won, and this will be a trophy of our victory. In the middle of the night, the Greeks sneak out of the horse and conquer Troy, and the Greeks win. So the Trojan horse is sort of a story about, infiltrating the enemy with, using, I guess, deceptive tactics. But this is the guy who tells the Trojans, don't bring the horse into the city. It's full of Greeks. Bad idea. And the gods and the goddesses who are sort of the ones who write the script, who want history to unfold the way they want it to, they're like, hold on, buddy. You're not supposed to tell them what we know. So what do? They send snakes or some kind of sea serpent to kill this guy and his children, to shut him up, because you're not supposed to. Like, the plot says this is the script. You're supposed to follow the script. So it's just an example of someone who's doomed by being prophetic. He has the prophecy of knowing more than everyone else, and he's doomed by that because he's not allowed to change the course of history. So this is basically, even though that's what I just told you is a story of what I just told you, in fact, this is a way of Rome tracing its roots back to Troy, because Rome, the founding of Rome, came from the people who fled from Troy. They went around the Mediterranean seeking a new homeland, kind of like the Jews seeking a homeland, or people, taken forcibly from Africa, eventually coming to terms with kind of some sense of identity. Likewise, you've got these Trojans who lost their identity because the Greeks destroyed their homeland. And so people like, I think it was Aeneas, he traveled around the Mediterranean seeking a new homeland and finally found Rome and settled there. And so this is actually kind of an origin story for Rome. And so this is much more than just this story. It speaks to the greater kind of Roman story. And one other example of the influence of Alexander the Great on sculpture is an Eastern example. from all the way in India, where Buddhism originated. And we see that here with the Buddha, who up until this point, you weren't allowed, and by allowed, I mean culturally, it was prohibited to bring the Buddha to life in physical form. But after the Greeks reached India, that changed, and the Buddha suddenly started visualizing the Buddha in physical form. And you can even see some attributes that show, I think, the influence of one culture. What do you see in anything you see? Well, I guess you can see here, the fold of the fabric really capture a lot of the things we've seen today, the way the skin underneath is shown, but especially that shifting weight. The Buddha kind of is relaxed. He's not like rigid, he's very chilling. And so I think this is such a beautiful example of two cultures influencing each other and doing so in a way that's almost invisible. And yet when you do kind of look, you see it. And yet you still feel like this is still a culture that's preserved and still kind of its own, but with these subtle influences. And now the question you might ask then, well, what about the other way around? Did the Buddhists or did the Eastern world influence the West? And that we will see some really interesting examples of that, especially with Christianity being the result of the Roman army conquering Persia, and then Mithraism, the religions of the East, influencing the Roman Empire to become Christian. So it does go back and forth. It's a two-way street whenever you have conquest and expansion. And maybe one last moment to do a shout out to the Buddha here. And so we will see next class that the Roman Empire, which you really see in the form of Caesar Augustus, really has a lot of resemblance to the Alexander the Great legacy in some ways. Young leader, no beard, very much kind of powerful, very theatrical, but with a notable difference, he's wearing clothing, he's not naked. And so we'll explore this more next class, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. Have a good day. Class dismissed. That wasn't so bad, was it? All right.